My name is Clara Morgan, and the sound of my father's voice still echoes in my ears like a verdict carved into stone. Your Honor, he declared, his hand raised as though swearing an oath of betrayal. My daughter has never been fit to raise a child. She is irresponsible, unstable, and incapable of providing a real home. The words struck me harder than any battlefield injury. I had been prepared for Daniel, my ex-husband, to come after me. I had braced myself for his expensive attorney, for the smug half-smile I knew he'd wear as if the case were already in his pocket. But I had not prepared for this. My own father standing in the witness box, painting me as a failure. I sat at the defense table in a plain gray blazer, hair pulled tightly into a bun that screamed discipline more than style. My palms pressed together, but my knuckles whitened as his testimony unspooled like barbed wire across the courtroom. She disappears for days at a time, he continued, his voice gaining strength with each accusation. She claims she's working, but who knows where she really goes? She lives in a shabby apartment, drives a car that could die any day, and half the time she can't even make it to her daughter's school events. Meanwhile, Daniel offers stability, a steady home, a father who's present. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The left side of the courtroom was packed with Daniel's supporters, his parents, his siblings, his friends who'd come to lend weight to his case. They nodded along with each of my father's words like an orchestrated chorus of judgment. On my side, just two fellow nurses sitting stiff-backed, their scrubs swapped for plain dresses, their faces tense with silent support. They knew what I did. They knew where my time went. But their truth was drowned out by the sheer weight of blood relation, by the betrayal of the man who had raised me. I forced myself to look at the front row. Emily sat there, 9 years old, her brown eyes wide, her little hands twisted in her lap. Confusion clouded her innocent face. How could she possibly understand why her grandfather was tearing her mother apart in public? Your Honor, my father pressed on, my granddaughter deserves a stable future. Clara, she's always chosen her work over family. Always. And that's not what a child needs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap to my feet and rip apart the lies, but years in uniform had drilled restraint into my veins. Instead, I breathed through the tightening in my chest, letting the silence build after his words. I could feel Daniel's smug gaze from across the aisle, his attorney scribbling notes with the certainty of victory. The judge, a stern woman with unreadable eyes, finally lifted her chin and addressed me. Ms. Morgan, how do you respond to these accusations about your employment and your ability to provide for your daughter? The courtroom fell into silence. Every eye was on me. My father's gaze bore into mine, cold, unflinching, certain he had delivered the fatal blow. I rose slowly, deliberately, every muscle coiled with control. I straightened my blazer, adjusted my breathing, and let the weight of the moment settle on the room. Your Honor, I said, my voice even but firm, I intend to respond. But first, I turned toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. I would like to call a witness. The words stirred the room like wind through dry leaves. Daniel's lawyer's pen froze mid-stroke. My father's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering for the first time. The judge tilted her head, intrigued. And as the doors began to creak open, every heartbeat in the room seemed to quicken, because no one expected what was about to happen next. The double doors swung open, and the squeak of the hinges cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned, even the bailiff straightened. Into the room walked a tall woman in full military dress uniform. Her posture was ramrod straight, her chest lined with ribbons and medals that shimmered under the unforgiving lights of the courtroom. She carried herself with an air that instantly shifted the balance of the room, commanding, resolute, undeniable. A wave of whispers rolled through the gallery. Who is that? Why is she here? Daniel's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering furiously, flipping through their case files as if a missing page might explain what was happening. My father's expression went from certainty to something else, hesitation. For the first time, doubt cracked the mask of his confidence. The judge raised her brows, clearly caught off guard. Ms. Morgan, would you care to identify your witness? I turned back to the bench, letting the silence hold for just a heartbeat longer. Timing mattered. Silence could weigh more than words. Then I said clearly, Your Honor, I'd like to call Major General Sophia Hayes, Deputy Surgeon General of the United States Army, to the stand. The reaction was immediate. Audible gasps echoed through the room. One of Daniel's supporters dropped her pen. Even the court reporter paused, fingers hovering above the keys. General Hayes approached with calm authority, offering the briefest of nods to the judge before placing her hand on the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the clerk asked. "I do," she replied, her voice steady, confident. When she sat, her eyes found mine for just an instant. It wasn't pity. It wasn't sympathy. It was recognition, one soldier to another. I stepped closer, folding my hands to mask the adrenaline coursing through me. "General Hayes," I began, my tone measured but strong, "could you please identify me for the court?" She turned her gaze toward the judge, her words carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "You are Lieutenant Colonel Clara Morgan, Chief Trauma Surgeon for the United States Army Medical Corps. You have served with distinction for over 15 years. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. My father's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked as though the ground beneath him had given way. Daniel's lawyer blinked, shuffling papers, desperate to find anything that could counter this testimony. Daniel himself leaned back in his chair, his face draining of color, as if realizing the case he thought he'd already won had just shifted entirely out of reach. General Hayes continued, her voice calm but firm. "Lieutenant Colonel Morgan has completed 3 combat deployments. She has led surgical teams under direct fire, overseen field hospitals during mass casualty incidents, and saved countless lives, soldiers and civilians alike. Her record is exemplary. Her evaluations spotless. She is among the finest officers I have had the privilege to command." Emily, my daughter, sat frozen in the front row. Her wide eyes glistened with tears, but this time not of confusion, of dawning pride. She had never understood why her mother sometimes vanished for days, why I returned home bone-tired, sometimes silent, carrying invisible burdens. Now the pieces were clicking together, and the light in her face was worth every sleepless night I had ever endured. I turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor, I believe that addresses the concerns about my employment." The judge's expression had shifted, not biased, not emotional, but intent, focused. She wasn't looking at me as a defendant anymore. She was looking at me as someone who had just rewritten the narrative in front of her. Daniel's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, we had no prior notice of this witness." The judge raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. "Overruled. The court will hear her testimony." The gallery buzzed again, voices overlapping in hushed disbelief. My father stared at me, shaking his head slowly, as if the daughter he had thought he knew was a stranger he had underestimated for her entire life. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. I stepped closer to the stand, my voice gaining strength. "General Hayes, could you also describe the qualities Lieutenant Colonel Morgan has demonstrated in her service, qualities relevant to her role as a mother?" She nodded once. "Discipline, leadership, compassion under pressure, the ability to make life and death decisions with clarity, even under fire. Above all, resilience, traits any child would benefit from in a parent." I glanced at Emily. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, as if she finally understood what I had sacrificed and why. And for the first time that day, I felt the tide turn. The silence in the courtroom weighed heavier than any gavel strike. General Hayes's words still hung in the air, echoing in every corner of the chamber. For years, I had lived quietly, intentionally small, because I thought blending in would protect my daughter. And now, here it was, my truth, unveiled in the most public and unforgiving arena. The judge leaned forward, her tone even but laced with curiosity. "Lieutenant Colonel Morgan, the court has now heard testimony establishing your service record. Why then has your family been kept in the dark about your career?" I drew in a breath, steadying myself. This was the moment. The courtroom brimmed with anticipation, Daniel's lawyer gripping his pen like a lifeline, my father pale and rigid, Emily staring at me as if she were seeing me for the very first time. "Your Honor," I began, my voice calm yet deliberate. 8 years ago, after I was promoted to lieutenant colonel and took command of trauma operations, I made a choice. I chose to separate my professional life from my personal one, not because I was ashamed of my work. Quite the opposite. I did it because I wanted my daughter to have a normal childhood. A hush spread deeper over the crowd. I've witnessed what happens to children of high-ranking officers, I continued. The constant scrutiny, the whispers at school, the pressure to be perfect because of who their parents are. I refused to let Emily carry that burden. I wanted her to know me first as her mother, not as an officer, not as a rank, not as a title, just mom. I turned slightly, looking at my father, his eyes narrowed, confusion battling stubborn pride. You said I disappeared for days. Those were deployments, missions, emergency surgeries halfway across the globe, and you called that irresponsibility. But what you saw as absence was sacrifice. Sacrifice to save lives, to serve this country, to protect the very freedoms that allow us to sit in this courtroom today. My words cut sharper than his accusations had. I could see it in his expression, his certainty fracturing. I stepped back, letting my gaze sweep the room, letting the weight of my story fall on everyone present. I drove an old car because I sent my money toward Emily's schooling, toward savings for her future. I lived in a modest apartment because I refused to let rank or paychecks define her sense of worth. She deserved to grow up knowing the value of humility, not entitlement. Daniel's attorney shot up again, desperation dripping from his voice. So you admit, Ms. Morgan, that you chose secrecy, that you deceived your family, including your daughter, about your true occupation. Doesn't that show instability, a lack of transparency unfit for a parent? The gallery erupted in murmurs. I waited for silence, waited for the judge's nod before answering. No, I said firmly. It shows protection. It shows discernment. It shows I understood the difference between privacy and deceit. I never lied to Emily. I simply shielded her. And while you call it instability, I call it love. A stir rippled through the courtroom, this time not against me, but in recognition of a truth too sharp to ignore. Emily's little hands unclenched in her lap. She leaned forward, her eyes shining with pride, as if my words had lifted a veil she hadn't even known was there. That look gave me the strength to press further. I pivoted toward Daniel. You stood there for years, married to me, and never asked what my late nights meant. Never wondered why I came home with medical texts, why I left at odd hours. You assumed the simplest, most convenient version of me, that I was nothing more than a hospital clerk. And you were content to believe it because the truth would have forced you to confront your own inadequacy. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. I looked back at the judge. For over 15 years, I've dedicated myself to saving lives. I've stitched together soldiers under fire. I've flown into war zones where helicopters were my only shield. And yet I stand here accused of being unfit by people who never cared enough to ask, never cared enough to see. The tension in the room reached its peak. Even the court reporter slowed, as if unwilling to miss a single word. General Hayes spoke again, her voice adding iron to mine. Your Honor, I can attest personally. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan is not only a model officer, but also a mother who has refused every promotion that would take her farther from her daughter. She has turned down opportunities, lucrative ones, so she could remain closer to Emily. That is the definition of sacrifice. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. For the first time that day, my father dropped his gaze. His hand shook slightly where it gripped the witness stand. Daniel's attorney shuffled his papers, sweat beading at his temple. And Daniel himself, once smug, once certain, looked at me with something new. Not respect, not admiration, but fear, because he knew the narrative had shifted. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just defending myself. I was standing in my truth. The room pulsed with silence after General Hayes's final words. It was the kind of silence that came when truth had cracked open the floor and no one dared to step forward. I returned to the defense table and pulled a slim black folder from my briefcase. The leather was worn, edges frayed, a soldier's folder, not a lawyer's. But inside it carried the weight of 15 years of discipline and integrity. Your Honor, I said, stepping toward the bench. In addition to General Hayes's testimony, I would like to submit 3 exhibits into evidence. Daniel's attorney groaned audibly, his chair scraping the floor as he half rose. Objection, these documents weren't disclosed during discovery. Sit down, Mr. Wilkins. the judge said sharply, her patience thinning. If Ms. Morgan has relevant evidence, this court will review it. I placed the documents on the clerk's desk, sliding them forward with deliberate calm. Exhibit A, I announced, my official service evaluations. They confirm my rank, my duties, and my exemplary record, signed by multiple commanding officers over the years. The clerk handed them up to the judge. She scanned the top pages quickly, her expression unreadable. Exhibit B, I continued, my financial disclosure forms. As required for officers at my level, I file annually. They reflect a stable income, government benefits, and savings earmarked for my daughter's education. Contrary to the claim that I can barely provide for her, I maintain financial stability well above the national average. This time, murmurs spread through the courtroom. Someone in Daniel's gallery coughed awkwardly, the sound sharp against the tension. And finally, I said, my voice rising, Exhibit C, a custody evaluation prepared by Dr. Elaine Porter, a child psychologist appointed by the military family court system. Her findings confirm I have a strong, nurturing bond with Emily. She found no concerns, none whatsoever, regarding my ability to provide care, stability, or love for my daughter. The judge took her time flipping through the report. The gallery leaned forward collectively, like an audience watching a verdict unfold in real time. Daniel's lawyer scrambled, his face paling as he whispered frantically to my ex-husband. Daniel himself stared at the table, his earlier bravado draining like sand through an hourglass. When the judge looked up, her eyes were harder, sharper. Mr. Wilkins, she said, do you have evidence to contradict these documents? He cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and finally muttered, no, Your Honor. The blow landed like a hammer. I turned, facing the courtroom, letting my words cut cleanly. For years, I have stitched broken bodies back together under mortar fire. I have carried children from bombed-out schools and returned them to waiting parents. I have made choices no parent should ever have to make. Who to save when there weren't enough resources to save everyone. And yet, despite all that, I am accused of being unfit to care for my own child. My voice trembled now, not with fear, but with conviction. What's truly unfit, Your Honor, is the idea that a woman's worth as a mother can be reduced to the car she drives or the size of her apartment. What's dangerous is assuming absence means neglect instead of sacrifice. What's shameful is that my own father, without ever asking what my work demanded, stood here and testified against me. Gasps echoed again. My father flinched as though I had slapped him. His shoulders sagged under the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. I shifted toward Daniel. And as for my ex-husband, he was married to me for nearly a decade and never cared enough to learn who I was. He mocked my long nights, dismissed my exhaustion, and now seeks custody by painting ignorance as evidence. But ignorance is not evidence. It is willful blindness. Daniel's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the floor. General Hayes's voice rang out again, firm and measured. Your Honor, I'd like to add one thing. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan turned down a promotion to full colonel because it would have stationed her overseas for 3 years. She chose instead to remain close to her daughter. If that isn't proof of a mother's devotion, I don't know what is. The courtroom erupted, whispers, shocked faces, even nods of respect from strangers who had entered this room expecting scandal but were now witnessing revelation. The judge banged her gavel twice, silencing the noise. This court will not tolerate interruptions. However, she paused, her gaze flicking to me, then to the stack of documents in her hands. The record before me is compelling. I stepped back, drawing a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down but no longer suffocating. For the first time since entering this room, I no longer felt like the defendant. I felt like what I truly was, a mother, a soldier, a protector, and above all, the only person in that courtroom who had nothing to hide. And I knew as I returned to my seat that the gavel would soon fall in my favor. The air in the courtroom was so heavy it felt like every breath carried the weight of a verdict. My documents sat stacked neatly on the judge's bench, my service record, financial disclosures, and the psychologist's report all shining brighter than any argument Daniel's side had tried to muster. The judge tapped her gavel lightly once, not to silence the room, but to mark the moment. This court, she said, her voice steady, has heard extensive testimony and reviewed compelling evidence. The claims of instability and irresponsibility leveled against Lieutenant Colonel Morgan are unfounded. Quite the opposite, the evidence demonstrates extraordinary stability, commitment, and sacrifice. Her words rang like a bell. Therefore, she continued, her gaze shifting from me to Daniel, custody of the minor child, Emily Morgan, is hereby awarded to her mother, Lieutenant Colonel Clara Morgan. Visitation rights for the father will be supervised for 6 months, with future adjustments contingent upon the completion of court-ordered parenting classes. A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed by whispers, gasp, even a few quiet claps stifled quickly under the gavel's second strike. Daniel slumped in his chair, his jaw clenched, his attorney pressing his lips together in defeat. My father, once so sure of himself, sat frozen in the witness box, his hands limp against the wood. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. The man who had tried to strip me of my dignity now looked like he no longer recognized the woman standing before him. And then Emily moved. She leapt from her seat, her shoes clapping against the tile as she ran toward me. "Mom!" she cried, throwing her arms around my waist. I bent down, clutching her so tightly I could feel her heartbeat pounding against mine. Her small voice whispered against my ear, trembling with awe. "Mom, you're a colonel." Tears pricked my eyes, but I smiled through them. "I'm your mom first, that's the only title that matters." Her giggle broke the dam of tension that had held me prisoner for weeks. She pulled back, her eyes shining with pride. "But it's kind of cool, right? You save people, you're like a hero." I laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes. But the most important job I'll ever have is being your mom." Behind us, the courtroom emptied slowly. Daniel left first, his head bowed, his lawyer muttering into his ear. My father lingered, standing stiff, his lips trembling as if an apology fought to break free. When he finally stepped toward me, his voice cracked. "Clara, I didn't know, I thought." I stood tall, Emily's hand in mine, my gaze unflinching. "You thought wrong, Dad, and instead of caring enough to find out, you chose to believe the worst. You testified against your own daughter. That's not something I can forget." His eyes glistened with shame, but I turned away because some betrayals carved wounds too deep to be healed with words. General Hayes approached quietly, her presence still commanding but softened by the faintest smile. "Lieutenant Colonel, I hope this moment reminds you that integrity will always outshine rumor. You've proven it again today." "Thank you, ma'am," I said, my voice steady. "If anything, this trial has reminded me why truth matters, why we fight for it no matter the cost." She nodded once, then left, her metals catching the light one final time before the doors closed behind her. Emily tugged my hand as we walked out of the courtroom together, the marble halls stretching before us. "Mom," she said, her voice curious and bright, "are you going to keep being a soldier?" I looked down at her, the weight of years in my chest, and smiled. "I'll always be a soldier. But more than that, I'll always be your mom, and from now on, I won't hide who I am, not from you, not from anyone." The sunlight spilled through the glass doors ahead, warm and unyielding. As we stepped into it, I realized something vital. Hiding my light hadn't protected me, it had only given others the power to underestimate me. Now, walking forward with Emily's small hand gripping mine, I knew the truth. Justice isn't only something you serve on the battlefield or in the courtroom. Sometimes, justice is the courage to stand in your own truth, and I had claimed mine.